Hello, this video lecture is on Speaking to Persuade, which is our chapter 16. And the first thing we want to do is look at the overview of what this chapter is going to be about. Our objectives and goals in this chapter are to explain the ethics of persuasion, the way that's relevant both to the speakers and the listeners. We want to differentiate among the three types of persuasive speeches. We're going to describe with examples some of the three types of influence, and then we'll also explain with examples Aristotle's three modes of persuasion. We're going to apply the four strategies to establish common ground with listeners, and then we're going to talk about how we organize our persuasive speech arguments appropriately. So the first thing we want to do is talk about sort of the nature and value of persuasion. Persuasion carries with it, it's kind of a loaded term. People hear the word persuasion and immediately they think that this is about control, it's about manipulation. But we want to really examine the value of persuasive speaking. It provides the opportunity to affect change. Most of our political discourse is persuasive speaking. When people running for political office run a campaign ad, they're engaging in persuasive speaking. They're persuading you to vote for them. When someone is encouraging you to support an initiative on a ballot that you already agree with, they're persuading you to reinforce the values that you already have. One of the values of persuasive speaking is that it affects change. It raises awareness of issues and solutions. Even if you don't agree with the position that someone's talking about, you're learning a great deal about their side of the issue, and then you can kind of create your own arguments against, or you can start to reevaluate their side of the argument. And that helps to develop those critical thinking skills. It's why we require in our public speaking classes a persuasive speech, because that really is one of the best ways for you to develop your critical thinking skills. We're going to talk later on in another lecture video about argumentation and fallacies and all of that. But there are some misconceptions about persuasion. I get students all the time who will tell me, Dave, I'm so excited to do the persuasive speech because I love to make change. I love to change people's minds. I love to convince people to think the way I want them to think. And the reality of that is, if you set as your main goal to change people's minds with your persuasion, you're going to fail miserably. What persuasion is about is influencing. And the misconception is people think, well, in order for me to be a good persuader, I have to have more power than the other person. Or if I have less power than the other person, I'm always going to be on the receiving end of persuasion. Persuasion does not require power imbalance. People with low power can influence people with high power, and people who some people who don't have a lot of political capital can also influence as well. People also think it involves manipulation and coercion, so we're skeptical of all persuasion. We will look at TV ads and think, oh, that's just their coercion, their rhetoric. It doesn't always exist that way. Most of the communication that we get is through persuasion. Commercials, political discourse, your college classes, are engaging you in some form of persuasion. So one of the things we want to talk about in the ethics of persuasion is that there are two levels of responsibility that exist when it comes to persuasion. Speakers have a responsibility. They have to use their influence ethically, and they have to connect to listeners' values, attitudes, and beliefs. One of the things you should be doing when you are engaging in your own persuasive speeches is figure out how you can tailor your message to make it consistent with your audience's your listeners' values, attitudes, and beliefs. If you're trying to convince them to support a particular policy, help them understand that this policy is consistent with their value of privacy or safety or their family values, or their belief that we should all have equal rights, or that our water should be safe enough to drink. That's like a civil expectation. So connect to those. Listeners, you have a responsibility. You get to choose whether or not you are persuaded. Your text makes this great argument. They say, in one sense, all persuasion is self-persuasion. We're rarely persuaded unless we participate in the process of persuasion. So the idea here is that you get to choose. When people say persuasion is manipulative, you can only be manipulated if you want to be. So understand that it's not a passive process. Listeners can make the choice about whether or not they can be persuaded. And that's the speaker's responsibility. Cut through that skepticism and make the listener want to be persuaded. So let's talk about the three types of persuasive speeches. The first is the speech to convince. This influences listeners' beliefs or attitudes. This is kind of the ultimate goal that everybody has for their persuasion. We want to convince people to take our position, to change their minds, to embrace your position. And like I said, this is a tough sell. It's tough to get everybody to be convinced. So if you can do that, if you can convince everybody, influence their beliefs and attitudes, then that's great. But rarely can we do that, especially in a classroom speech where you've only got 7 to 9 minutes. So the next type of speech is what we call a speech to actuate. This is where we encourage an audience to take some sort of action. You can get them to take action without actually changing their minds. You can get them to investigate for more information. You can get them to sign a petition. You can get them to go to a meeting. So speeches to actuate actually encourage the audience to take some sort of action at the end of the speech. You can have a speech to convince that also has a speech to actuate. Our speeches, the ones we're engaging in, the speech to defend a policy, is a speech to actuate. You want the audience to actually take some action in getting your policy passed. The last is a speech to inspire. These speeches don't really require an actuation, and they don't really require you to convince an audience. They are designed to get your audience to be inspired to do things in a different way, or in a better way, or even in the same way. Speeches to inspire would be things like, take more time for yourself, take more naps, become more involved in politics, or watch more television. You want to inspire them, and in the course of that, maybe motivate them to take action, but essentially you're getting them to feel better about themselves. These three types of speeches are important. If you're wondering which speech we're doing with the speech to defend a policy, that is going to be a combination of a speech to convince and a speech to actuate. You want to kind of move that needle and get your audience to think, okay, I want to take a position on this policy. I like this policy. I want a way to get involved. I may not be convinced the policy works completely, but at least I know that there's some potential here, and I think I'm going to get involved by writing a letter or doing something along those lines. You can also request change in an audience. You're going to request listeners to change a value, belief, attitude. Again, this is very difficult. It's rare in a speech that you're going to change somebody's mind on something. I get students who will say, well, what if I just have that one piece of information? I can change somebody from pro-choice to pro-life. I can change somebody from pro-gun to anti-gun. The likelihood that you're going to change anybody's mind. Remember, if we go back to our audience analysis discussion, we talked about that hierarchy of psychological aspects of the psychographic characteristics of your audience. The hardest to change are values. Most all of our beliefs, all of our opinions, our attitudes are tied to core values. So sometimes change will require you to change a core value, and that's not going to happen. So while change feels like the ultimate goal of your persuasion, it's rare that we're going to make change. So can you change a small thing? Sure, you can change somebody's opinion about something. You can you can fill in a gap that somebody has that might change their belief system in a small way. A great example of this, I think I used this in my other video, I can't remember, but when gay marriage was being debated, marriage equality was being debated, 10, 15 years ago, The number of people who were not supportive of marriage equality or even broadening LGBT rights in this country was about 70%. But then when you did the polls to find out how many of those 70% actually knew a gay person, the answer was very few. So it's easy to hold beliefs about an entire segment of the population, the LGBT community, if you don't know anyone who's LGBT. Today, when we do those polls, it's like, 70% are for marriage equality and are for broadening LGBT rights. And most of those people would say, oh, yeah, my neighbor's gay, my teacher's gay, my brother's gay, my son is gay, or my daughter is gay. So, change can be limited. You can make a limited change. So one of the things we want to do is think about the continuum of persuasion. If you've got someone who's kind of neutral in the middle, then good persuasion can move that needle a little bit. You can encourage them to oppose the belief. You can get them to even just slightly oppose it or slightly be more in favor of it. At the end of your speech, you have moved someone from zero to even here. You've affected persuasion. So this is the point we make. Persuasion doesn't have to be change. It doesn't have to be, you've instilled. It just means that you've engaged in some degree of persuasion that at the end of that speech, your audience and your listeners can say, I was here, now I'm here. I was slightly in favor of this, but now I'm moderately in favor of it. If your goal is to push them to strongly, you might succeed, but even if you don't, you've still succeeded in some persuasion. If you've engaged them in a way that moves them from slightly to moderately, or if you're moving them in the other direction. If you've got an audience that's strongly opposed to what you're talking about, by the end of their speech, though, they're not so strongly opposed, they're just moderately opposed. Now you've engaged in some persuasion. Okay, so types of influence. You can persuade neutral listeners that the problem exists. So one of the ways we engage in persuasion is to get them to understand that a problem exists. The thing I love about the speech that you're getting ready to do is the first thing you're going to do is convince them that there's a problem with the status quo. So you're going to instill in them a belief that there is a problem. That's good persuasion. If at the end of that speech they can say, well, I don't like your policy. I don't think your policy is going to work. I don't agree with it. But you now have convinced me and made me believe that, we have a problem with the status quo. I don't think your solution is going to fix it, but it makes me want to explore other positions. You can also intensify. Many people in your audience are already going to agree with your position, so the feeling is going to be, well, what am I doing? How do I persuade them? You're persuading them by strengthening their position, like getting them to say, gosh, I was in favor of this, but now I'm even more in favor, or now I'm fired up to actually act on my beliefs. You can change believers into advocates. You can have people in your speech who say, I always knew this problem existed, but now you've given me a way to get involved. That's good persuasion. So in other words, you haven't changed their mind on something. You've just instilled in them a belief that now they want to get involved. And you've intensified their belief that getting involved is actually the right thing to do. You can change believers into advocates and advocates into activists. And I think those are two good ways of viewing persuasion. So one of the things that your text talks about, and this is one of my favorite things to talk about, and that is Aristotle's The Rhetoric. Aristotle was a scholar who lived in the ancient Greek-Roman days. And the interesting thing about persuasion back in those days is that persuasion was called rhetoric. Rhetoric and persuasion are basically interchangeable terms. The power of rhetoric, however, was so important in ancient Rome, ancient Greece, because the entire judicial system and the political system was based on your ability to persuade. For example, you didn't have lawyers then. If you were brought up on charges, you stood in front of a jury of your peers, members of the citizenry, and they would vote. They would decide your fate. And they decided that by your ability to argue, your ability to stand in front of that jury and argue your case. And if they believed it, great. If they didn't believe it, well, you were out. And the scholars of the time, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, they formed schools, academies that were teaching people the art of this wonderful thing called rhetoric. But Aristotle got really upset because there were a lot of these sort of what we call pseudo-scholars who we called the sophists. And the sophists were kind of fake scholars who believed that they had figured out the concept of rhetoric and decided that they wanted to make a little money off of that. So they would go from town to town and say, "Hey, don't bother with Aristotle and the scholars that are going to charge you a fortune to sit in their little seminars. We've got these little treatises that have all these sort of recipes for things you can do in your court case. So if you want to get out of an embezzlement charge, we have these 5 arguments that work, and here's how you can get the jury to kind of cry and feel sorry for you. And if you're up for theft of a small product, here are 5 other arguments you can use." And Aristotle and the other scholars, but Aristotle especially, became incensed over this and said, no, rhetoric is an art form. It's one that has to be taught in a way that it is appreciated, not just this sort of gloss that you put over your arguments. And we know about the power of rhetoric today because when we hear the term rhetoric, we think of it in a very negative term. When we hear politicians speak, we always say, oh, that's just their rhetoric, because rhetoric got such a bad name back then. What Aristotle decided to do is to rescue rhetoric. And he basically said, look, I'm going to write this book called The Art of Rhetoric, or The Rhetoric. And what he did was to make the argument that good rhetoric must be a combination of 3 what we call persuasive proofs. And he labeled those ethos, logos, and pathos. Now, you've probably heard these terms in other classes, an English class, a writing class, maybe a sociology class or a philosophy class. They came out of persuasion, however, and they are the foundation of persuasion. What Aristotle said was, if you hire the sophists will probably give you some stuff about pathos and maybe a little bit about logos. But what they can't do is give you ethos. You can't develop your credibility. Character matters. And they might give you some emotional arguments to make, but if you don't have evidence in your case, you're not going to win. It must be a combination of all of these. And that was such a powerful way of looking at rhetoric that we still use those 3 proofs today. So I want to talk a little bit about these. The first thing we want to focus on is what we call ethos, the root word of ethics. So ethics are important. And what we use ethos for is to talk about what we mean by speaker credibility. In public speaking, it's your speaker credibility. When you stand up in front of an audience, you have credibility with that audience. For all of you, if you were delivering this 3rd speech in front of an audience, they would have heard you already twice, which means you have credibility with them based on their previous experience with you. If you've never spoken to them before, one of the things I talk about is dressing appropriately, speaking to the audience and making eye contact, being articulate when you talk, slowing down. We use presentational aids to try to get the points across. Every listener has a different expectation for that credibility, but everything is filtered through that credibility. If you don't have credibility, your arguments will not matter. And this is one of the things Aristotle said about the sophists. The sophists can give you all these little recipes to kind of fake out your jury, but if the jury has seen you before 3 other times for the same crime, they have already formed an impression of you, and all of that, fake arguments are going to fail. Think about a court of law. One of the first things we do with a defendant when he or she walks into a court of law is to change their appearance. They wear a different outfit. They comb their hair. They wear a suit. They wear a nice outfit, professional. A great example of this, many of you may not remember this case, but it was the Jodi Arias case. Jodi Arias was a sort of party girl / stripper who had an affair with a young Mormon man. And the Mormon man broke some of his religious vows and his religious beliefs to have an affair with her, and then midway through the affair decided that he was feeling a little guilty and did not want to see her anymore. She, however, didn't want to take no for an answer, kept stalking him, and eventually cornered him in his shower and stabbed him about 30 times. She denied it. She went on the lam. Then they finally caught her. Now, all the pictures of Jodi Arias that were hitting the media were of this stripper girl. She was in bikinis and her hair was all bleached out and she was drinking, and there were all of these sort of shots that really portrayed her as this woman with, this kind of sketchy background. When she came to trial, however, hair in a bun, dyed brown, these big librarian glasses, a blouse that was buttoned up to here with this big bow. And the goal was to kind of manage her ethos that had already been determined by the media. They had to undo that. It's hard to unring that bell, though, right? So one of the things we do with ethos is it requires your competence. You've got to know your subject. This is why I have you do audience analysis. This is why you sit down and figure out who your audience is. Document your ideas. Make sure your ideas are clear. Your audience should know exactly what you're talking about. This is why we cite sources. Sources are important because you can derive your speaker credibility. I always say, you're not an expert on the topic, but if you can tell your audience, I've done all this research and here's the research that I'm giving you, then they will say, okay, now I know you're credible because you have found credible sources. And then give your own personal experience. If your personal experience enhances your ethos, absolutely, put that out there. Speaker credibility requires trustworthiness. Establish common ground. Part of what an audience likes is to know that you're one of them. They also want to know that your research is unbiased. If you're trying to persuade us with sources that are inherently really biased toward the point you're making, we're going to reject that. This is why when I talk about gathering sources, don't gather sources that have been put out by a company that's trying to sell a product, because they're going to only give information that supports the selling of that product. It also requires caring. Empathy is important. Ethos is important to empathy. You can't be empathetic if you don't have credibility. Otherwise, empathy comes across as fake. So good speaker credibility means that you are empathetic. If you pick a topic where you want to change something, have empathy for the change that you're making. If you want to help the homeless, please demonstrate that you have some empathy for the homeless. The worst kind of speech is a person who wants to help the homeless but still believes the homeless are so far beneath them that they simply want to help them to make themselves feel good about it. That's not really good persuasion. Demonstrate concern for the listener's best interests. What are you doing for them? How does this persuasion help them? At the end of the day, I'm going to be persuaded if I believe this policy affects me or someone I care about. So there are 3 stages of credibility as your ethos is developed. The first is your initial. It's based on prior experience of the role. So when you stand up in front of an audience, the first thing I do is say, oh, okay, I've heard this person speak twice before. They're really good. Or, I don't really like, this person. I heard their first 2 speeches and they weren't all that great. A really good example of this is Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the presumptive nominee for President of the United States in the 2020 election. The problem with Joe Biden is years and years ago when he was running for president, he was in a terrible plagiarism scandal. He'd given a speech and uttered some words that he did not attribute, and someone found them and accused him of plagiarism, and he had to really backtrack. So the problem is when we first started hearing Joe Biden talk about running for president, we had an initial opinion of him. We had initial ethos toward him, and that was based on those prior experiences. And like I said, it's hard to unring that bell, but you can. You can also then what we call derived credibility. This is based on verbal and nonverbal behaviors during your speech. So you have to win your audience. This is your ability to make eye contact, to have a soft, comforting voice. This is your ability to use hand gestures, to know your material and make your audience believe that. Derived credibility comes from your sources, right? If you don't have any credibility on this subject, you're going to talk about water quality, but you are not a chemist, then you can cite sources as long as you're saying, according to the Journal of Water Safety, according to the Journal of Chemical Engineering, then your audience will say, oh, okay, they're not credible, but they have what we call derived credibility. And terminal credibility. You want your ethos to linger long after that speech. You want your audience to think about that speech and in their mind think, wow, that speaker was so good. That speaker made me want to listen to that. This is why we have a statement of credibility, and this is why you have that statement of significance in your persuasive speeches. They're not just there as, random bullet points. They're there to establish that ethos for your audience. So one of the things I wanted to do is give you a couple of examples. I gave you the Jodi Arias example. Here's another one that was really important. There's a man by the name of John Edwards. John Edwards ran as John Kerry's running mate when John Kerry ran for president. John Kerry lost, but John Edwards' kind of stock had begun to rise as a political figure in the country. He was young, good looking. People thought he was very what we call Kennedy-esque, like John F. Kennedy. And so people were really looking to him probably to run for the Democratic nomination in the next presidential cycle. The problem was that he had been dogged by rumors that he had been cheating on his wife with a woman by the name of Rielle Hunter, who was his personal photographer. He had denied it all the time, and he kept saying, no, this isn't true, this isn't true. And, reporters had dogged him. Nobody had really found any information about him. Until the National Enquirer happened to snap a picture of him in a hotel lobby with Rielle Hunter holding a baby. And this is one of the earlier pictures before she'd had her baby that they kept posting on the National Enquirer page, and people were kind of like, yeah, this looks fake, nothing's happened. And the National Enquirer finally got a picture of him holding the actual baby that had been born, and nobody cared. Like crickets. And the National Enquirer kept saying, look, we finally have proof. Here is a picture of him holding a baby next to Rielle Hunter, who's no longer pregnant, so clearly this is her baby. But nobody said anything. Nobody cared. And then about 3 days later, John Edwards held a press conference and basically said, hey, by the way, this is my love child, and I have to come out and admit it. His political career tanked. The next day, it was all over the news, New York Times and Washington Post and everything. The National Enquirer, however, kept saying, hey, wait a minute, we broke this story. We're the ones who outed John Edwards as having this love child. Why is no one paying attention, giving us credit? They actually applied for the Pulitzer Prize, the highest journalistic award you can get, and everybody basically laughed in their face. And the argument here goes to ethos. The ethos of this paper was that they are a tabloid. They make things up. They fake stories. They do, Donald Trump met with a werewolf to talk about, werewolf policy. And everybody laughs at it and takes it for what it is as a joke. So when they put something in their newspaper that actually has political merit, nobody pays attention. And, if the picture that the National Enquirer had put had been on the front of the New York Times, everybody would have paid attention to it because the New York Times has ethos. So ethos matters. And that's a really good, kind of a great example of that. The other modes of persuasion are logos. Logos is the logical arguments that you make. This is the sound reasoning. When you walk into a court of law and you've dressed your client up in a suit, you can't just say, hey, jury, look at my client. Do they look like they would be a killer or a murderer or a thief? Of course not. End of case, find them not guilty. Ethos is not enough. You have to use ethos to then present your logical arguments. You have to have really good evidence. This is why in your speeches, I have you manage your ethos, you cite your sources, but you also have to have really logical arguments. Your arguments have to actually make sense. So one of the things we do with logic is we can build logic through examples. You can build through stories. You build through citations. It can be expert testimony that you're pulling from other people. So logic is the foundation. So if I use my court of law as an example, in a court of law, all the evidence that I'm presenting, fingerprints and videotapes and eyewitness testimony, that's all the logic. That's the logic. And if my defendant looks guilty, right, they've not managed their ethos, they've not managed their credibility, then all of that logos doesn't matter. Because people are going to look at that and say, well, they probably faked the fingerprints, or, those eyewitnesses are lying. So you've got to manage both. You have to have good ethos. You have to have good logical arguments. Notice the picture in the National Enquirer of Riel Hunter and John Edwards was logical. I mean, that was valid information, but nobody paid attention to it because of the ethos in which it was presented. So that's a really good, I think, analogy to pay attention to. The last thing we want to talk about is pathos. Pathos are the emotional appeals. And one of the things that Aristotle said was that emotion is a powerful part of how we persuade. As humans, we think both with our minds and our heart. So when you can make an emotional appeal, it just is like the icing on the cake. But here's what Aristotle says. You can't just use pathos alone. You can't just walk into a room and cry and say, I don't want to go to jail. Don't convict me. I promise I'll never do it again. And having a jury acquit you, even if all of the logic is going against you. Or if you present no logic at all and just say, this is my defendant, he didn't do it, watch him cry, watch him apologize, and hope that the audience or the jury says, oh, well, those emotional appeals got to me. What Aristotle says is you've got to have a combination of all three. We can't just persuade with emotion alone, you can't persuade with logic alone, and you can't persuade with ethos alone. It has to be a combination of all of those. We see pathos all the time. When we watch commercials, for example, we get pathos. Here's a really good example. When you are watching television and you see an ad from the ASPC, the animal rights organizations, and they want you to donate money to help support their cause, they say in their commercial, we're the ASPC, ASPC, you can donate to us. We'll take your money to help starving animals and abused animals. Every year, so many millions of animals are abused. Every year it costs us X number of dollars to take care of those animals. If you don't want any more animals to be abused, please write a check. Thank you. Is that the commercial? Is it pie charts and line graphs? And is it, words on a screen that says, please donate to us? No, part of that's there. But the other thing that's there are the pictures of sad animals in a cage staring at you, and Sarah McLachlan on a sofa with her dog, and in the background the song In the Arms of the Angels playing. Because at that point where you add that emotional component, all of those pieces of persuasion come together. The ASPC is ASPCA, and I knew I was pronouncing that wrong. The ASPCA has ethos. They're a respected organization. They have all the logos. They're going to give you all those statistics about the millions of animals that are abused, and then they seal the deal, the icing on the cake, with the pictures of the abused animals and the sad puppies and the music in the background that makes you want to grab your checkbook or your credit card and donate to them. That's the power of what Aristotle called those persuasive proofs. Let me give you another good example. For a long time after the Vietnam War, the Vietnam War was the first war that was actually broadcast to our living rooms. So Walter Cronkite, for example, is one of the most respected journalists from the 1960s and 70s, famously said, if we've lost the country, then we've lost the war. His lamentation was on the fact that every night the news broadcasters were publishing pictures of stretchers being carried out of the Vietnamese jungles and flag-draped coffins, and that had never been done before. We'd never televised our wars, and as a result, the attitude toward the war began to drop tremendously. And part of that was because of the emotionalizing of the war. In previous wars, we just heard about casualties and we heard about numbers, and that wasn't in our living rooms every night. Now, every night, we were not just hearing there were 14 Americans killed. We were literally seeing 14 stretchers and 14 coffins. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just a number. It wasn't just logos. It was pathos. It was, there's a body in there, and that body belonged to a family. And then somebody just lost their son or their father. Or their brother. So the next war that we fought was the Gulf War in 1991, and George W. Bush made a decision, or George Herbert Walker Bush made a decision that he was going to ban flag-draped coffins from being shown in the media. Like, he banned the media from showing any images of flag-draped coffins. And that lasted all the way through to the Obama administration. And President Obama took office. We were still in the midst of the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. And one of the things that happened was a journalist who worked for the Seattle Times decided that she was going to violate that rule. And she published this picture on the front of the Seattle Times to huge backlash from the rest of the media who said, hey, we've been told we can't do this. The government who said, wait a minute, this is, God, you can't do this. And it became a real big uproar. And other media organizations started following suit. And Barack Obama famously lifted that ban. But the ban existed because when George Herbert Walker Bush, the first George Bush, went to war, he said, look, I don't want this war to be emotionalized. The minute we start emotionalizing this war, it takes on a different tone. So I'm going to control the emotionalizing. The minute we add pathos to the way people feel about this war, and not just how much is it costing and how many troops are we sending. No, when you add the pathos, people start to treat it much differently. And he thought, I can't lose this war. We can't. This first war we've had in 40 years. So this is the kind of the lesson about ethos, logos, and pathos. One of the things we talk about is connect with your listeners. I tell you constantly, do your audience analysis. Assess what your audiences know. Here's a tip for good persuasion. The less your audience knows about your topic, the more likely it is that they will be persuaded. Why is that? Because they don't have preconceived ideas. So if you can instill a belief in them for a topic they've never heard about, boom, perfect position for you to affect change. Instilling that belief that they didn't have before is great. But we don't want to exploit your audience. So, exploitation is bad. So when you are, exploiting their emotions, if you're saying, if you don't vote for this policy, you're all going to die, that's unethical. So you have to maintain that. So the less knowledge they have, the more likely it is they'll be persuaded. But make sure that you're not exploiting them by saying, look, you've never heard of this topic. Well, now that I've got your attention and it's the most dangerous thing you're ever going to have, and we've got to solve this right now, or your kids are going to die and you're going to die. It doesn't work that way. You also want to assess how important your listeners consider your topic. This is why when I talk about those statements of significance, your audience may say, well, this topic doesn't apply to me. Why should I listen? This is why you say, well, it may not apply to you, but it applies to someone you care about. It applies to a loved one. It applies to your friends. It could apply to you in the future. So help them believe that this topic is important to them. Motivate your listeners. Understand their needs. We go back to those values. One of the ways I can get an audience to feel like they want to get involved in my topic is I can, help press upon them that this is costing you money. People don't like to spend money. Their need is to save money. And then, by passing my policy, taxes are going to go down, or it's not going to cost you as much to maintain your home or your education. This right now, you want to protect your family. Your family isn't safe as a result of this. My policy helps make your family safe. Helps bring freedom to people that are oppressed right now. You don't want to believe that you're part of the problem in keeping people oppressed. You want to help the homeless. Many in your audience are not homeless, but may be one paycheck away from being homeless, or may know someone who's homeless, or may feel like my community is better if I get homeless. The homeless population into a stable situation. It can't help but help me as well. Those are all ways to get your audience to feel like their needs are being met by your policy. Relate your messages to your listeners' values. Identify beliefs consistent with your message. We believe that, all boats should be lifted equally. We believe everybody should have equal access to healthcare and education and secondary education. Connect with your audience on shared beliefs. You're like me. I believe that this should be a moral country, and that we should have a moral obligation to do this. Or, you probably believe that when I turn on my tap water, I want clean water. You're like me. So connect with that. Request action then consistent with those beliefs. The minute you ask somebody to do something that's not consistent with their belief system, they're going to reject it. So this is one of the things that you do when you are trying to engage in persuasion is they have to believe that the values you are asking them to have to support this policy are the values they agree with. This is why we go back to change. You can't change. You're never going to change somebody's mind on abortion if their belief system is that life begins at conception. Nor are you going to change somebody from choice to pro-life if they believe that a pregnancy is a part of a woman's body that she gets to control. If it requires you to change a core value, you're never going to succeed. So you've got to find the ground that you can connect with your audience on. We also have what are called primacy and recency theories. When we organize our persuasive speeches, the best way for you to persuade an audience is to engage in a process where your audience is compelled by things that are either very primary or the most recent. The way I have you structure your persuasive speeches, for example, is I want you to begin by emphasizing that there's a problem. Primacy theory says that audiences are compelled by the thing they hear first, because they believe that's likely to be the most important. So any of your important arguments you put first, I think it's important that they understand that the status quo is broken. We need to fix it. And within that discussion of the status quo, put your strongest arguments at the beginning. Compel them right away. People are dying. This is costing us money. This is breaking down our infrastructure. Then when you move into the cause step and then the policy step, hopefully they were already engaged. So determine your strongest argument, present that early, then repeat that argument later when you get to that policy step. That's when you have that nice review of the main points. Or when you go back and say, well, here's my policy. Remember all that stuff I talked about in the status quo? Well, here's how that policy fixes that. So at the end of the speech, they're remembering the last thing you talked about, which was, your policy. And they also remember that, oh, that's right. He brought that stuff about the status quo back. This also works in a court of law. I mean, this is another one of my kind of analogies. In a court of law, the burden of proof is on the prosecution. So you have a defendant who's being charged with a crime. The defendant does not have to prove that they're innocent. The prosecution has to prove that they're guilty. So they have the presumption of innocence. The defendant has the presumption of innocence, which means they have to convince a jury or a judge that the defendant is guilty. Given primacy recency theory in a court of law, the prosecution gets to go first. They get first crack at the jury because they get the benefit of primacy theory. Then the defense gets to stand up and say, hey, the prosecution didn't prove their case. My client is still innocent. They didn't have enough evidence. They didn't have this. Then when they get to closing arguments, the prosecution gets to go first again. They get first crack at the jury to say, let me sum up all these arguments. Let me really give you, the gist of this trial because I'm the one that has to make the proof here. Then the defense gets to stand up and kind of tear those arguments apart. And you'd think, oh, well, doesn't that give the defense recency, the power of recency theory? No, because then the prosecution gets to stand back up and give what's called the rebuttal closing argument. They get the last word. That's because, again, they have the burden of proof. They have to make all the arguments stick. The defense does not. So kind of keep that in mind when we think about the idea of primacy and recency theory. We also want to talk about what we call the refutation pattern. One way that you strengthen your persuasion is to present an argument that your audience has against your policy. So, for example, maybe you've given a policy that says we're going to fix water. By doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to raise taxes, and so therefore people are going to pay more taxes. That means that we'll have more money in the bank to start putting better filters in our municipal water system. And somebody might be thinking, well, wait a minute, if you're going to raise taxes, why don't I just dig my own well and use my own water? Right? And, so if I'm just going to spend that kind of money anyway to have city water, I might as well make my own water. Not sure that's feasible, but that might be an argument that someone has that would keep them from supporting your position. The refutation pattern says that you're going to bring that up. You might say, now, some of you may be thinking, I'll just, dig my own well and use my own water, not pay for the city. Well, that's not really a good idea. You know how much it costs to dig your own well. Not only that, but the city water has gone through all of these tests. They're tested typically every day. We have up to date equipment that's going to filter that water. There's no problems with cross contamination, any of those things. In other words, you're going to bring up the argument that the other person might have against your policy and then refute that. That's what we call the refutation pattern. It's not enough just to present all your arguments. You got to bring up a couple of their arguments and then prove to them why their arguments are wrong. Right, so that's why in your upcoming speech, I have a place where I say offer a counter argument. Counter argument is that refutation pattern. Bring up an argument they might have against your policy. Offer evidence that this is wrong. This ain't going to happen. This isn't going to work. And then your audience then that argument against your policy has been disempowered. Okay, so that's this kind of the strategy of persuasion. That's kind of all the way we're going to look at persuasion. It kind of underlies what you're going to do in your speeches. I've got two other videos that you're going to watch. One is on argumentation. This is on how the structure of persuasion, and then we're going to look at logical fallacies. So this is a kind of a long, extended discussion of persuasion, but it's really helpful and important. So I hope you got something out of this. Look forward to having you watching the next couple videos. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email, and I will see you in the next video.